Hello and welcome. In a previous episode of the National Express story, we looked at the birth and the creation of National Express. Now, as I said in my previous video, both National Express and National Holidays started out pretty much the same way. So when I do the video on National Holidays, which will probably be in the next few months, I'll just do a brief recap and point you in a general direction of the original video. In our previous instalment, we got up to the mid-1970s, so I shall resume from there. Sit back comfortably as we explore up to deregulation of the coaches and the effect this had on National Express and the introduction of the Rapide services. In the end of the previous video, I said that the business of National Express was picking up and things were looking rather good for them. 1977 would see the last of the Ribble and Standerwick Bristol VRLLH coaches being withdrawn, and at this point, apart from a lone AEC Regent 5, the national fleet was all now 100% single deck. April 1977 would see the acquisition of the London to Clacton service of B-Line. The old established route pioneered by Empire's Best and later operated by Bamfield's coaches of Nunhead in South East London was taken over jointly by National Travel South East and Grey Green, and after pruning it back from Nunhead to Victoria, it was integrated into the East Anglian Express network. Slightly later on in the year, some of the Red Dragon services from Swansea to London were also speeded up, and some journeys were scheduled to cut up to half an hour from the previous running time. Also in 1977 saw the establishment of a new interchange in Sheffield. Brought into operation on September the 25th, it was set up inside the National Travel Easts Limited former Sheffield United Tours depot at Charlotte Road. The former bus garage was modified to provide passenger accommodation and passenger facilities, and at 2:30 in the afternoon each day there was a comprehensive link-up of services. This improved the situation for passengers no end, because it meant that they could actually now reach numerous destinations which wouldn't have been possible without several vehicle changes. However, despite these changes to the service network and the ones mentioned in the previous video, 1977 was a bit of a disappointing year financially, especially for National Travel South East, who sustained a heavy financial loss. At the start of 1978 there would be further service changes, and after this Yellowways of Rochdale surrendered their Lancashire to London service to National Travel West. Now they brokered a deal with this because they did this in return for increased duties on the Lancashire to the South West corridor, and from the 9th of September 1978 Yellowway took a share in the National Express service 355 from Sheffield to Colchester. Now this was a route that Premier Travel of Cambridge were also involved in running. Sadly, again, despite all these service changes and revisions, during 1978 there was to be a general decline in the use of coach services all over Britain, not only just with the National Bus Company but also in the private sector too. In an attempt to try and reverse this trend, National Express launched the White Arrow Express. Now it does sound like a parcel delivery company, doesn't it? But trust me, it wasn't. This operated between London, Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool, and had much quicker journey times than the original service. Plus it was coupled up with promotional cut price winter fares. This resulted in the fastest journey between London and Liverpool being 4 hours and 35 minutes. And this did prove very popular with passengers, with increased loadings and bookings being noticed. Around this time, National Express introduced non-smoking seats at the front of the vehicle. Now this is something that a lot of younger generation people tend not to realise, that the smoking on buses and coaches used to be a normal thing. And on top of that as well, there was no climate control on the older coaches. You might be lucky to have a sliding window near your seat, or to sit somewhere where the draft of a skylight would get you, but that would be it. So not only would you end up melting in the sun, but you'd also end up smelling of cigarette smoke too, which was great, wasn't it? To also help increase passenger ridership, National Express commenced an incredibly large advertising campaign beginning on the 25th of November 1978. 1979 would see a further 10% reduction in the number of passengers carried over from 1978, so it was actually still dropping the amount of passengers that were carried. Further route restructuring and tweaks were made during 1979, and to save even more money, the Central Activities Group, which had been set up in the previous video, we talked about that then, was disbanded, and National Express and National Holidays each had executive directors appointed to oversee their operations. The first executive director of National Express was Mr. J.B. Hargreaves, who initially had his headquarters in Droitwich, but then was subsequently moved to Edgbaston. And I think it's fair to say that this was the point that National Express and National Holidays kind of went their own ways completely, rather than being both subsidiaries of something even bigger. Now, they were still owned by the National Bus Company, of course, but they were just being individually managed. 1980 would see National Express back trying to recapture its lost passengers. And in addition to modifying and improving some of the network in the UK, they also thought about introduction of summer timetable continental services. These would include such services as the 779 from South Wales to Paris, which was reintroduced on the 18th of May, as well as the 777 from Cheltenham to Paris. There was also a 776 service from Plymouth to Paris via Bournemouth, Southampton and Le Havre. And this was run in conjunction with P&O ferries, with the return fare from Plymouth to Paris being £42.25, which included a reclining sleeper seat on board the ship. These coaches that were used on this service were painted in a special livery, which included lettering showing the route and the P&O logo as well. And again, this would really be the start of the livery of National Express being adapted in various different ways. Up until this point, it's safe to say that the National Express livery was quite restricted and quite strictly adhered to. On Monday the 6th of October 1980, the 1980 Transport Act was implemented, and this act scrapped the express service licensing system, which had been ineffective since 1930, and basically replaced it with a free-for-all rugby scrum. Providing that passengers were being carried for a distance of 30 miles or more, services didn't need to be registered with the area traffic commissioners. Now, this was a bit of a double-edged sword for National Express, because although it would make things easier for them, it would also open things up for competitors to sneak in and start running express services in competition with them. However, on a positive note, it meant that British Rail and other licensed coach operators could no longer object to National's own development plans. Now, slightly before this, and faced with the prospect of the new Transport Act, National's planning team had set to work to lay the foundations for a new service network and fare structure, which they hope would effectively shut out any competition on the coach industry. A bit like the bus industry, there had been the market analysis project, but for the express coach work. And using the results of this, there were numerous frequency changes on existing services, and a number of new routes were announced. To help publicise these new fares and new routes, National Express gained a new mascot, and this was a promotional frog who'd been designed by schoolchildren and christened Beeper. Beeper fares were known to be extremely low and provided many travel bargains in the months following his introduction. Beeper was also involved in the launch of numerous promotions for National Express, and quite often would appear on vinyl adverts on the rear of coaches, telling motorists following behind the promotional prices for travelling by coach. Shortly after the deregulation of the coaches, on the 6th of October, there was a flood of new express coach services by numerous operators, just as National Express had feared. Although many of these competitors featured competitive fares, it was obvious that many of these wouldn't be around for a long time, as the market obviously could only support so much competition. One of the biggest threats to National Express was British Coachways, which was formed by Grey Green, Wallace Arnold, Morris Brothers of Swansea, Elm and Beeline, Shearings, Ribblesdale and Parks of Hamilton. Now, I will be doing a separate video on British Coachways in the future, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but needless to say, spoiler alert, it didn't exactly work. National Express could see this happening and were very quick to increase the frequencies of their services and indeed drop their fares. An example of this being that the single fare from Keighley to London was reduced from £8.60 to £4, whilst the return fare for the same journey was almost halved from £15.50 to £8. In December 1980, the competition reached its fiercest peak, with British Coachways revising some of their services and in addition introducing new routes from London to Edinburgh at £7 for a single ticket. And as a result of this, National Express also reduced some of its prices and its fares too. Amongst these reductions was £16.75 to £7.50 for a single from Bristol to Glasgow, and also a £5 beeper return from 7 points in South Wales up to London. Now again, this was a turning point for National Express, because at the end of 1980 it was clear that this had been the right move. The number of trips had increased by some 27% and their revenue was up by 14% when compared to the previous year. Building on this success, National Express took the opportunity to further increase the frequency of many of their services with the introduction of their summer timetable in May 1981. However, there was a downside to all this success and the enormous increase in traffic. And this was in the peak times. Victoria Coach Station was becoming vastly overcrowded to the extent it could not accommodate all the coaches wishing to use it. To solve this problem, the former Samuelson Garage in Eccleston Place, which is just over the road from Victoria Coach Station, was pressed into use as an alighting point for all the National Express services terminating in London. And although this initially helped, on busy summer Saturdays and Sundays, further space was sought as the overcrowding problem returned. Fortunately for National, British Airways closed their central London terminal, which was situated directly opposite Victoria Coach Station in Buckingham Palace Road, and it was therefore possible to gain the use of this area to load up coaches bound for the South West and South Wales. And now you can start to see how all these videos that I've done are linked up. Not only the previous National Express video, but we've looked at the aircraft buses and the aircraft coaches, the BEA AEC Regal 4s and the BEA Routemaster buses, as well as the BOAC Leyland Atlanteans. November 1981 would see Wallace Arnold announce that they were going to come out of the British Coachways consortium, and they would be running their own London to Plymouth and London to West Yorkshire services in their own right, under the Pullman Express banner. Now, a coach company called Trathens were already operating a Plymouth to London service, which was very well patronised. In the spring of 1981, Trathens had acquired a competitors company called Glenline. And on the 8th of November 1981, Trathens joined forces with National Express to introduce their Rapide shuttle. This still terminated in London at Gloucester Road Coach Station, but the service operated 4 times daily in each direction, and it was a non-stop service with a journey time of 4 hours from Plymouth to London and 3 hours and 10 minutes between Exeter and London. This was operated by Trathens' new Neoplan double-decker coaches. Now, it might surprise you to know that Neoplans are among my favourite coaches. Even as a child, I loved that futuristic looking design that they had. And when I worked for a company called Buzzlines in the mid-2000s, of course they had a big fleet of Neoplans, and I was in my element. Absolutely lovely vehicles. Now, obviously at this point, National Express didn't have any coaches of this standard themselves, so they were forced to hire 4 MAN single-deck coaches from Trathens, which they could operate their share of the route with. In order to make sure that the services were non-stop and they didn't have to take refreshment breaks and comfort breaks, The new Rapide coaches were all fitted with onboard toilets, video televisions and a servery from which hot drinks and snacks were served en route by smartly dressed stewardesses. For a new service with these sort of facilities, the fares were regarded as being extremely modest. It was £5 for a single and £7 for a day return, and £10 for a period return between Plymouth and London. Now, although these sort of facilities on coaches had been seen way back in the 1960s on the Standerwick Gay Hostess coaches, they hadn't been seen for a while, and this created quite a stir amongst the passengers. Now, the Wallace-Arnold service, the Pullman service that they were operating on the same route, was also a non-stop basis and used coaches also fitted with toilets, video TVs and a servery. However, unlike the Trathins National Express Rapide operations, these offered half fares and free coffee was served en route. It certainly seemed like a good time to be a coach traveller, didn't it? September 1981 would see the launch of a parcel service under the title National Dispatch, and this was in conjunction with Marloway Limited, a specialist parcels pick-up and delivery organisation in London. And this would see parcels initially between London, Birmingham, Manchester and Liverpool being delivered by coach. Well, not literally delivered, but to the nearest coach stop where they would be picked up by a Marloway representative. Towards the end of 1981, National Express began their new air coach services to London's Heathrow and Gatwick Airport. The services to Heathrow operated from Cardiff and Newport, whilst those to Gatwick operated from Bristol, Bournemouth and Southampton. Now, National Travel had insufficient coaches to operate the whole of the National Express network, so to maintain the services, coaches from the various National Bus Company subsidiaries were also scheduled throughout the year. However, during the peak and especially during the summer months, even these weren't enough to move all the crowds wishing to travel from A to B, and it was common to find coaches from a wide range of independent operators or local authority coach companies hired to operate National Express duties or to provide duplicate vehicles. The coaches used on this basis were highly vetted to make sure they met the high standards laid down by National Express, and it was not unknown for the occasional inferior vehicle or clunker to be sent back to its owners without being used or paid for. The payment made for the hire of suitable coaches was 1p per seat per mile, so for a 53-seat coach it would be 53 pence per mile. 1981 would also see the launch of two more named services by National Express. The first would be the Norfolk Flyer, which was introduced on the 26th of April, and this would provide direct links to London from the smaller East Anglian towns which had not previously enjoyed these facilities. Later in September, the Express West service, bit of a mouthful, was launched, which linked Bristol, Swansea and South Wales with London. By the beginning of 1982, it was reported that the rise of National Express passengers had reached 73%. They'd had a 73% increase in ridership. That's amazing, isn't it? Having established themselves now as the leader in express coach travel, National Express felt the cheaper beeper fares were no longer necessary, and from the 31st of January 1982, beeper was quietly retired and the fares were discontinued in favour of a modified range of ordinary single and return fares. Following the success of their Rapide operations in the West Country, National Express introduced similar services under the Rapide banner from London to Swansea and from London to Manchester during 1982. However, despite the planning, they realised that they didn't have enough high-quality vehicles to operate these services. So again, more MAN single-decker coaches were hired from Trathins. Again, these featured an onboard toilet, servery, video TV. These MANs worked on the Swansea route. Meanwhile, the Manchester operation was operated by National Travel West, and they had refurbished 3 duple-bodied Leyland Leopards to Rapide standard, which left something to be desired, to be fair, especially when compared to the Trathins coaches. But to give them credit, at least they did allow the services to start. But it became very obvious to National Express that if the Rapide was to be a success, it would need custom-built, high-class vehicles. It was decided to buy a small batch of Dennis Falcon V chassis and fit them with specially modified duple Goldliner bodywork equipped to full Rapide specification. And these coaches made their debut in service in the autumn of 1982. Shortly before this, though, another Rapide service was started, and this was from Yorkshire to London. Now, Wallace Arnold were already operating a similar service under their Pullman banner, and they felt it would be more advantageous to all concerned if these services were merged together, and so from the 11th of July, the Yorkshire Rapide was launched, jointly operated by both Wallace Arnold and National Express. Now, obviously, Wallace Arnold already has suitably equipped coaches, but of course, West Yorkshire Road Car Company Limited and Yorkshire Traction, who were going to provide the coaches for the service, didn't. So again, they hired more MAN coaches from Trathens. The highly regarded Rapide services were quoted as taking the coach travel into the jet age. And apart from a couple of scheduled stops at the start and near the end of the journey, the whole service was non-stop and made full use of the motorway network, and yet allowed for the comforts associated with coach travel to be enjoyed. 85% of the passengers on board welcomed the video entertainment. The 15% obviously didn't. And for the Rapide facilities, you had to pay slightly more money. On the Rapide, the single fare was £7 compared with £6.50 on the service between Harrogate and London. And there we go, friends. We have reached the end of another episode of the National Express story. And in the next episode, we will look at the continued growth and rise of the Rapide services and into the deregulation of the bus services and how that affected National Express. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please like and share it, and don't forget to comment below with your stories on the National Express and your recollections of National Express, whether you drove for them, worked for them, or indeed just travelled on them. Or indeed if you just like the National Express song by the Divine Comedy. I'm happy to hear whatever you got. Thanks so very much for watching. Bye for now.